In 1943, as the world was being torn apart by war, thousands of German soldiers were captured and sent far from the battlefields they once knew. They crossed the ocean not as conquerors, but as prisoners of war, destined for a place they had only heard about in propaganda, the United States of America. For most of them, the word America meant chaos, crime, and corruption. That was what they had been told by the Nazi regime, but what they were about to witness would change their understanding of the world, their beliefs, and even their identity as soldiers of the Reich. When the ships carrying them arrived at American ports, they expected the worst. They had seen how the German army treated prisoners, starvation, fear, humiliation. They imagined the same awaited them. Yet when they disembarked, something unexpected happened. American officers greeted them not with hatred, but with order and calm. They were given food, blankets, and medical care. Some were even offered cigarettes. One prisoner later recalled how stunned he was to be served coffee by an American soldier, a small gesture that shattered years of Nazi indoctrination. From the ports, the Germans were placed on trains bound for the heart of the country, to Kansas, Texas, Colorado, and Wisconsin. As the trains moved inland, they gazed through the windows at landscapes unlike anything they had ever seen. Wide open skies, endless farmland, clean towns untouched by war, no rubble, no ruins, no bomb sirens. The prisoners had grown up hearing that America was a nation of chaos and poverty, yet what they saw was a place thriving while their own cities burned under Allied bombs. When they finally arrived at the camps, the surprise deepened. These were not death camps or forced labor sites. The barbed wire fences were real, but the treatment inside was humane. They were given beds, clothes, and 3 meals a day. They could write letters home, play football, even attend concerts. There were rules, yes, but there was also dignity. Each day began with roll call, followed by work assignments, farming, construction, or helping local industries suffering from the wartime labor shortage. It was in the fields of Kansas that many experienced their first true shock. They worked alongside American farmers who treated them not as enemies, but as men. These farmers shared water with them, cracked jokes, and sometimes invited them for meals under supervision. The POWs saw that even in wartime, Americans could separate a soldier from the ideology he served, and that small act of respect began to chip away at the psychological wall that Nazism had built inside their minds. The German soldiers had been told that democracy was weak, that capitalism was corrupt, that Americans were lazy and ignorant. But here they saw farmers driving tractors more advanced than any German machine. They saw women working in factories, earning their own wages. They saw children going to schools where teachers encouraged questions, not obedience. Slowly they began to realize that the Nazi image of America had been a lie. Inside the camps they found something else, choice. They could learn English, attend classes, or read American newspapers. Many began reading out of curiosity, then disbelief. They discovered stories criticizing the American government, freely published in newspapers. To a German soldier raised under censorship and propaganda, the idea that citizens could openly question their leaders without fear of arrest was revolutionary. One prisoner later said, "In Germany, I was taught to salute authority. In America, I learned to respect truth." It wasn't just words that changed them. It was what they saw every day. Guards who laughed and played cards after duty. Officers who treated enlisted men with fairness, not fear. These men lived democracy. They didn't have to explain it. The transformation continued quietly. Prisoners who once marched proudly under the swastika began to question what they had fought for. Some wrote letters home, trying to describe what they were witnessing, though every letter passed through censors. "Mother," one wrote, "we are treated better by the Americans than by our own officers. Another said, "They feed us meat twice a day. They let us play football. The people are not starving. Everything we were told was false." Even through censorship, those letters became seeds of doubt in a Germany collapsing under the weight of defeat. Families began to wonder what kind of barbaric enemy could treat their sons with such decency. It was the quiet beginning of psychological collapse, not through force, but through contrast. By 1945, as the war neared its end, news of Hitler's death and Germany's surrender reached the camps. The reaction was silence. Some refused to believe it. Others broke down, realizing they had served a cause built on lies. When American officers showed them photographs and films of the concentration camps, disbelief turned to shame. The ideology that had once given them pride now filled them with guilt. The war was over, but for many the internal battle was just beginning. They had entered America as soldiers of a totalitarian empire. They would leave as witnesses to freedom. In 1946, repatriation began. One by one, trains carried them east, back to a shattered homeland. On those long rides, the men spoke quietly among themselves. "We came as believers, and we return as men." Back in Germany, their story spread slowly. These former POWs carried with them not just memories, but a new perspective. They told their neighbors about towns where no one feared the police, where workers spoke freely, where even prisoners had rights. They spoke of abundance, stores filled with goods, farms overflowing with harvests, and they spoke of kindness, the kind that disarmed them more completely than any weapon.
Many of these men would later become part of the rebuilding of West Germany. They became teachers, journalists, and community leaders. Some even joined programs promoting democracy and reconciliation. Without fanfare, they helped shape a new German identity, one built not on blind obedience, but on conscience and reason. Their time in American camps had changed them, not through lectures, but through example. Historians often refer to this process as psychological re-education. But in truth, it wasn't re-education at all. It was unlearning, the slow dismantling of lies they had been told since childhood. It was seeing that freedom and discipline could coexist, that order didn't require terror, and that strength could come from compassion. By the early 1950s, interviews with former German POWs revealed the depth of that change. One former sergeant said, "It was not defeat that changed us, it was kindness." Another recalled, "They defeated us with bread, not bullets." Decades later, when historians traced Germany's post-war democratic values, they found that many of the early reformers had once been prisoners in America. America's victory in World War II was not only military, it was moral and psychological. In treating its prisoners with humanity, the United States had achieved something extraordinary. It had shown the world and its enemies that freedom was stronger than fear. The Nazi system had built loyalty through terror. America inspired respect through decency. In the years after the war, some former POWs returned to the United States, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. They wrote to the families who had once fed them during their captivity, sending photographs of their new lives. In small towns across Kansas and Texas, some American families still kept letters from those German boys who had worked their fields, thanking them for their kindness. The camps are gone now. The barbed wire has rusted away, the barracks torn down, the land returned to farms and towns. But the memory of that quiet victory endures. A victory won not by guns or propaganda, but by the simple act of treating an enemy as human. In 1943, they had arrived as soldiers of a regime built on hate. By 1946, they returned home as men who had seen a different truth. They had seen that democracy could feed its people, that equality could build strength, and that mercy could break chains stronger than steel. The story of the German POWs in America is more than a footnote in history. It is proof that the human mind, even when consumed by ideology, can be freed not through force, but through example. In the quiet fields of Kansas, far from the thunder of artillery, the United States won one of the most important battles of the Second World War, the battle for the human soul. Because, in the end, when the uniforms were gone and the flags had fallen, what remained was a simple truth. Humanity is the greatest weapon of all. When the trains rolled back into Germany in 1946, they carried men who no longer belonged entirely to either world. They stepped onto platforms lined with rubble and silence. The cities they had left behind 3 years earlier were now skeletons of brick and ash. Streets where parades once marched were buried under ruins. The once proud Reich had become a wasteland. These returning prisoners looked around, searching for the Germany they remembered, and found only ghosts. In the eyes of those waiting for them, families, wives, children, there was both relief and distance. The men who returned were not the same as those who had left. They no longer spoke with the same certainty about victory or destiny. They had seen another kind of nation, one that fought with machines instead of ideology, and built hope instead of monuments. Some tried to speak about what they had witnessed in America, but most people were too broken to listen. Food was scarce. Cities were starving. For a time, survival was all that mattered. The Allies had divided Germany into zones of occupation. In the West, the Americans began something unprecedented. Not revenge, but rebuilding. They understood that a humiliated nation could breed new hatred. So they did something rare in history. They helped their former enemy stand up again. The returning prisoners recognized the same patterns they had seen in those camps. Discipline with dignity, rules with reason. They saw the Americans rebuild schools, repair roads, and distribute food. For many, it confirmed what they had suspected since Kansas and Texas. America was not just a rich nation, it was a generous one. These former prisoners became quiet bridges between two worlds. They understood both the obedience of the old Germany and the freedom of the new. They knew what dictatorship sounded like and what democracy felt like. When the Allied administrators searched for local leaders who could be trusted, many of them turned to these men. They were disciplined, intelligent, and most important, changed. Some became teachers in new schools, emphasizing critical thinking over blind memorization. Others worked in newspapers, where they helped establish the free press that the new German Republic would rely on. A few entered politics, cautiously at first, trying to shape a new kind of patriotism, one built not on conquest, but on conscience. The transformation wasn't simple. In 1947, resentment still simmered. Some Germans mocked the returnees, calling them America lovers. Others whispered that they had been brainwashed by the enemy. The truth was more complicated. They weren't brainwashed, they were awakened. They had seen how a country could thrive without propaganda or fear. They had learned that dignity could survive defeat. That faith had been planted in the minds of men who arrived as enemies and left as witnesses. It had survived the ruins, the poverty, and the shame. It had become part of the German conscience. But even decades later, those memories remained vivid. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, elderly former POWs described their time in the camps not as imprisonment, but as education. One said, "They didn't try to teach us democracy. They simply lived it, and we saw it worked." Another remembered standing in a small-town grocery store in Texas during his work detail.